Welcome to Module 4, where we will explore climate change and gender. In this module, you will learn about gender and how gender interacts with climate change and infrastructure. We will also explore ways to mainstream gender and human rights into climate change, highlighting international, national, and community level documents and examples. By the end of this module, you will be able to define gender, understand why climate change impacts women and girls differently, understand gender-blind versus gender-responsive infrastructure, and describe strategies to improve gender equality as it relates to climate change and infrastructure. We will begin by covering 4 key concepts: gender, gender roles, gender inequality, and vulnerability. Let's begin by defining some important concepts. Firstly, what is gender? Gender refers to a socially conditioned set of characteristics for a specific sex that are learned right from the moment you are born. Gender may at times be confused with sex, which is the biological, anatomical, and physiological characteristics that you are born with and that are different in males and females. Gender includes social attributes and characteristics and determines what is expected, allowed, appropriate, or valued for a man or woman in a given context. So when you are born, typically you learn how to be your gender based on the information you receive from your environment, including your parents, peers, schools, institutions, media, religion, and culture. This process is called socialization and is different for boys and girls. For example, boys may be associated with the color blue, whereas girls are associated with the color pink. Boys may be given cars to play with, whereas girls are given dolls. Boys may be complimented on their abilities. For example, you are so strong. Whereas girls may be complimented on their appearance. For example, you are so pretty. What it means to be a specific gender and the gender roles that are prescribed to that gender, as we will discuss, may vary for different cultures or places. So we talked about gender, but what are gender roles? Gender roles are a set of characteristics, behavior, attitude, activities, and expectations that a particular society or culture assigns and demands from people of a particular gender. Gender roles shape everyday life, as well as opportunities for employment, participation in decision-making, learning, safety, and the use of community services. Gender roles affect the position or role that men and women have in society and shape the interests and skills that men and women are expected to have, including the division of jobs in the house and the labor market. So for example, what we may call traditional gender roles for women include being mothers and primary caregivers, maintaining the household, and doing domestic work such as cooking and cleaning. This may be in addition to paid work. Often the roles that women are expected to take on because they are women is called the triple burden, as can be shown in this image, and relates to their roles in reproduction, meaning child rearing, in unpaid household tasks or domestic work, and in paid work, and their role in the community. So women are often involved in maintaining community well-being. So let's now talk about gender inequality. Gender inequality and discrimination can arise when the specific needs of one group are not recognized or ignored, or when one group is treated differently because of their gender. Gender inequality can show up in all areas of life and society. For example, lack of access to basic education and therefore having limited knowledge and skills. Increased household responsibilities and unpaid domestic labor. A lack of access to equitable employment or employment opportunities in general. An inability to own property or land. a lack of participation in decision-making and governance, including being able to hold leadership roles, and inadequate healthcare services and infrastructure, specifically related to menstruation, pregnancy, and birth. One final key concept that is important for this module is vulnerability. During extreme weather events, climate hazards, disasters, or emergencies, certain groups of individuals may be more vulnerable. Vulnerability means they are more likely to be adversely or negatively affected, they are more susceptible to harm, or they have a lack of capacity to cope or adapt. Vulnerability can arise from different factors. Biological, for example, someone with a disability or someone who is pregnant. Physical, someone who is much more exposed to a hazard, such as someone experiencing homelessness. Economic, for example, someone who has fewer resources and is experiencing poverty. Social, for example, someone who faces discrimination or exclusion. For example, women may experience gender inequality, as we discussed on the last slide. Knowledge and information, for example, someone who lacks survival skills such as the ability to swim, and this could also be true for young children. And finally, political, for example, someone who is not involved in decision making. So vulnerability can stem from any of these factors as well as a combination of factors. In Suriname, rural and indigenous populations, as well as unempowered women, are most vulnerable or likely to be affected by climate change and disaster events. Now that we have a better understanding of gender roles, gender inequality, and vulnerability, let's explore how gender interacts with climate change. So we know that climate change has an impact on people. So for example, extreme weather, floods, droughts, fires, heat waves have an impact on people. And when we're talking about the impact, this can be, a strain on someone's income. It can be illness or injury, damage to infrastructure like their houses. There can be less water, food, or energy. There can be changes in wildlife and biodiversity around them. And there can also be a loss of culturally important places and practices. So climate change impacts people. But we also know, as we just discussed, that men and women have different gender characteristics, roles, responsibilities, and may experience discrimination or inequality. Due to these differences, men and women experience the consequences of climate change differently in both the short term and long term. Often, due to gender roles and gender inequality, women and girls are more vulnerable to negative impacts or consequences. For example, during a Suriname flood in 2006, it was reported that 54% of female-headed households were negatively affected versus only 46% of male-headed households. Let's explore some of the reasons why women are more vulnerable than men to climate change, and then we will look at some examples from Suriname. So the first factor is related to gender roles and responsibilities. Recall we discussed women experience the triple burden, which means they have roles related to childbirth and child rearing, household work, paid job, and maintaining overall community wellness. These roles and responsibilities may physically put women in places where they are more likely to experience harm from a climate impact. These roles may also make it more difficult for women to remove themselves from harm or make it harder to recover once they've experienced harm. The next factor is related to livelihoods that depend on natural resources that are sensitive or threatened by climate change. So we could call them climate sensitive livelihoods. For example, agriculture or fishing, which are strongly connected to environmental conditions and may be sensitive to various climate impacts. The next factor is limited access to resources and information, including education, technology, and institutional supports. disproportionate poverty and income inequality, which can also be tied to limited access to education and learning different skills to make them marketable in the labor force. Violence and displacement, including gender-based violence, which may occur after a climate impact or event in a shelter or during migration, for example. And finally, lack of participation in decision-making and political processes, including an inability to vote or an inability to own land. Another important concept is that climate change is often considered a threat multiplier and can worsen a cycle of gender inequality. So, gender inequality can make it harder to adapt and be resilient to climate change impacts. But in turn, the impacts of climate change can maintain or worsen existing inequalities. So let's explore an example of this. So let's say, as is the case for many communities, that women take part in agricultural activities for their livelihoods, including for their income and to feed their families and neighbors. Climate change can lead to changes in temperature, changes in rainfall patterns, and increased frequency of extreme weather events such as droughts and floods. These impacts can negatively affect crop yields and livestock productivity. Women in this community may have limited access to adaptation resources, for example, better irrigation systems for drought or improved seeds and climate resilient technologies, and therefore they are unable to adapt to these climate impacts. As a result of crop loss, they lose their ability to generate income and feed their families. As a downstream impact, their daughters have to drop out of school because they cannot pay for tuition, and this further amplifies gender inequality, in this case intergenerationally, so through generations. Furthermore, as they have lost their income source and the women have a hard time diversifying their livelihoods outside of agriculture due to limited opportunities, the cycle of poverty continues and the women and their families are overall less resilient to other climate change impacts. And so the cycle continues. Let's now look at gender roles and vulnerability in Suriname. In Suriname, women are more vulnerable to climate change due to their roles and responsibilities in the household and community. There is a very clear gender-based division of labor in the household where women do most of the unpaid work in child rearing. In Suriname, women make up at least half of the agricultural labor force, and agricultural practices are the anchor of Surinamese food security. Women also play a crucial role in natural resources management and other value-adding activities, not just in the household, but in their communities. Another source of resilience, but also vulnerability, is cultural practices which may restrict women's movement, leading to geographic isolation. Vulnerability in Suriname can also stem from political exclusion related to male dominance in more village governance, which results in unequal access for women to services, education, and information. Women's exclusion from decision-making is also relevant for Indigenous Surinamese women. While Indigenous communities in Suriname have strong independent governance practices with less interference from the state, which is necessary when managing crisis situations, women are not usually involved in decision-making, and consequently their needs are not represented or addressed. They are less likely to be involved in risk management and have minimum control over emergency recovery. The women and their families' access to aid is also affected, and Indigenous women and tribal associations need to be more involved in disaster risk reduction and climate issues. Currently, there is no structure or system for consulting with Indigenous Surinamese women. Let's explore a few examples of how climate-related events impact men and women differently. The following 3 examples are from a policy brief titled Gender Inequality of Climate Change and Disaster Risk in Suriname. Let's start by exploring an example of how a climate-related flood event would impact men and women differently. Let's begin by looking at adult men and women, so people who are over 25 years old. The impact that men would experience could include damage to housing, loss of livelihoods, and restricted access to health services and supplies. Women would experience those same impacts, as well as, due to their societal role, they may be at a higher propensity to be in a house during a flood. They may have less access to information and early warning systems. So again, having the information before the flood event occurs to be able to prepare. They may have an increased burden from their caregiving role, including during a flood event, if they have young children or babies, it may be harder to get to safety. They may be at increased risk of disease due to their proximity to contaminated water when performing household duties. They may have no access to health services, which is critical for women who are pregnant. They may have a lower livelihood resilience than men, and this could be due to lower income or less ability to seek out livelihood diversification. And finally, they may be at risk of increased gender-based violence and sexual trafficking. How would the same flood event impact youth boys and girls aged 14 to 24? So boys would experience the same impacts as men, so all of these impacts, as well as a disruption of education. Whereas youth girls, on the other hand, would experience the same impacts as women, so all of these impacts plus the impacts that men would experience, as well as they may be a higher propensity of education disruption because they must help with household duties, and in desperate cases, there may be a risk of early marriage. Finally, how would the same flood event impact young boys and girls aged 0 to 14? Young boys may be vulnerable to floods due to an inability to swim, as well as potentially diseases that are spread through the flood and stormwater. They may be at risk of disruption of education, so the same as young boys, and they may be at risk of child trafficking in desperate cases. Young girls, on the other hand, would experience the same impacts as for the boys, as well as they may be at a higher propensity of education disruption to help with house duties, and may be at risk of early marriage or child trafficking in desperate cases. Let's move on to a new example. In this example, we're going to look at how a drought event would impact men and women differently. So beginning with adults again, so age 25 and older, the impact of a drought on men could be food insecurity due to crop loss or damage and loss of livelihood, as well as migration. So due to a loss of livelihood, men may migrate to find jobs or livelihood elsewhere. Women may also experience food insecurity. However, this is particularly a risk for women who are pregnant. There may be an increased burden on their caregiving role. It may lead to low livelihood resilience, especially for single female-headed households, and this can lead to migration. And there may be increased gender-based violence and sexual trafficking. How would the same drought event impact youth boys and girls aged 14 to 24? So boys would experience the same impact as men, food insecurity and loss of livelihoods, as well as potentially a disruption of education following the drought due to the inability to pay for school fees. So if a drought leads to crop loss and damage and less income for the family, they may not be able to pay to send their boys to school. For youth, women, they would experience the same impacts as women, as well as a higher propensity of disruption of education, again, because of the inability to pay for school fees, but also to help with household duties. In desperate cases, young girls may experience an increased risk of early and non-consensual marriage. And finally, how would a drought event impact young boys and girls aged 0 to 14? So young boys would be particularly vulnerable to food insecurity. Young children in general would be vulnerable to food insecurity, Again, they may experience a risk of disruption of education and, in desperate cases, child trafficking. Young girls would experience those same impacts as the boys, as well as a higher propensity to drop out of school to help with household duties. And again, in desperate cases, an increased risk of early and non-consensual marriage. Our final example is going to look at the impact of an extreme weather event on men and women. So considering men and women that are adults, so 25 years and older, what would the impact be? So men would experience the same impacts as flooding. So recall they may experience damage to their houses, loss of livelihoods, and restricted access to health services and supplies. They may also experience trauma and increased alcohol consumption and socioeconomic inequalities impacting resilience. So depending on their income, wealth, access to certain resources, men may be impacted differently, and this can affect their long-term resilience to climate change. Women would experience the same impacts as floods. So recall they may experience damage to housing, loss of livelihood, restricted or limited access to health services. They may have less access to early warning systems, increased caregiving burden, increased risk of disease if they are using contaminated water, and they may have lower livelihood resilience than men. In addition, an extreme weather event may result in increased gender-based violence and sexual trafficking, which could also be the result of increased alcohol consumption by men. And similar to men, they may experience socioeconomic inequalities impacting their resilience. So depending on their wealth, resources, income, they may experience the consequences of the extreme weather event differently. How would the same extreme weather event impact youth boys and girls aged 14 to 24? So boys would experience the same impact as floods, so damage to housing, loss of livelihood, lower access to healthcare services. And young men with no prior employment experience may have difficulty building their livelihoods. Due to trauma, they may experience increased alcohol consumption and may migrate elsewhere to build their livelihoods. Young women would experience the same impacts as women during floods, so damaged housing, loss of livelihood, increased caregiver burden, less access to healthcare services, lower livelihood resilience. As well, young women with no prior employment may have difficulty building their livelihoods, which could result in migration. And for all of the cases, there may be an increased gender-based violence risk and sexual trafficking, also the result of increased alcohol consumption from men. Finally, how would the same extreme weather event impact young boys and girls aged 0 to 14? Young boys would experience the same impacts that men would experience during a flood, so they could experience damage to housing, loss of livelihood, less access to healthcare services and supplies. They may also be vulnerable to separation from their family, may experience trauma and develop aggression, and they may be victims of child abuse. Young girls would experience the same impacts as women during the flood, so damages to housing, loss of livelihood and lower livelihood resilience, increased risk of water contamination and diseases associated with that. They may also be vulnerable to separation from their family, similar to young boys. They may have better coping capacities with trauma, and they may be victims of child abuse. One final point about gender and climate change is that gender is not the only factor that can create vulnerability to climate change. There are many traits, characteristics, or experiences that make up a person's identity, as can be seen in this figure, such as race, education, religion, ethnicity, sexuality, age, and gender. This unique intersection can contribute to how vulnerable someone is to climate change. As we saw in a few examples from Suriname, there are different vulnerabilities for women and girls depending on their age. We could say the intersection of gender and age creates a unique experience of vulnerability to climate change impacts. We must consider the idea of intersectionality when talking about climate change to recognize a person's identity comes from the intersection of these many characteristics or factors. I encourage you to think about and take a look at this image and think about your own unique intersectional identity and how your unique identity could make you more or less vulnerable to different climate change impacts.